And so this morning we are stepping back into the world of Genesis, and I would encourage you as I'm preaching through it, to read through it, to read through Genesis. It's a great, wonderful. I mean, there are not that there are bad books of the Bible, but it's a really good book of the Bible. A lot of really good stories. 2 years ago now, I preached through Genesis 1 through 3. And in 1 through 3, what we really just saw was that God had created the world, right? Out of nothing, he created the world. And so we see this in Genesis chapter 1. And then man rebelled. So it says that God is good, right? God looked at the creation. It was good. It was very, very good. And then in that, right, and the goodness is that then man corrupted it. God said, I got one thing for you. I don't want you to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the day that you do, you will die. And they did. Their eyes were open. They were aware of their shame. They went into hiding. And the world spun out of control. And really what is the beautiful thing is actually in Genesis 3 is that God promises that he's going to restore it all. He says there's going to come a one. There's going to be a seed. And from that seed will be, I'm paraphrasing now, but from that seed will be redemption. And so even actually from Genesis 3, we are longing, we are wanting the redemption of the world. And what I really find interesting with Genesis is that really even today, like we have this sense that the world should be something other than what it is. It's interesting. I talk with non-Christians all the time, and it's like there's this sense of like this beautiful utopia where everyone gets along, everything is good, there's no death. Creation and humanity with creation as a part of creation is working beautifully together. I go, yeah. We actually are longing for the Eden in chapter 1 and 2. And really the promise is that's made in Genesis 3 is that God will take us back to that. And then we wait. And then last year I preached in Genesis 4 through 11. And 4 through 11 really is the story of Noah. And maybe Noah is the one who will restore it all. And he doesn't. But there's the flood. And out of the flood, then Noah and his family begin to repopulate the world. And where we left off was in Genesis chapter 11. In Genesis chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. Now, we get the term Babel. That's where we get it from, right? If someone's not, you're just babbling, which means you're just talking and making no sense. And so really it comes from Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel actually is going to be important because it's actually going to, we read the story, sometimes the Bible, we just go chapter 11, and then chapter 11's done, and now we're on to chapter 12, which is a totally different story, totally disconnected to 11. I go, no, these stories flow together. And so actually in 11 we see the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel, what God said, I want you to go and I want you to fill the earth. Go out and multiply, fill the earth. And the people at the Tower of Babel said, hey, how about this? How about instead of going out to fill the earth, what we do is we build a tower, and then everybody will come here, and then they will know how great our name is. That's what they said. We want to make a name for ourselves, and so we're going to build a big old building. And I go, you know what? Truth is, not much has changed in the world. Even today, people go, you want to get tourists? You build big old things, and people come from all over the world to see it. And that's actually Genesis chapter 11, not new. And what it says there is that they want to make a name for themselves. We're going to build this big old building that goes to the skies, to the heavens. And I love what it says there in Genesis 11 where God came down to see what they were doing. And could God see it from heaven? Of course he could. But I love what he does there. He goes, they're like, we're going to make this building so big, so high that it reaches the heavens. And then the next verse is like, and so God had to come down to see what the kids were doing. Like, oh, what is, I'm sorry, I couldn't see it from up there. What is it that you've built? And then God frustrates their ways. God frustrates them and gives them different languages so that they can't understand each other. They have unified in their rebellion against God. And then God comes down and then frustrates, as we see, their ways. He thwarts their plans. And then after Genesis chapter 11, Genesis chapter 12, where we're going to start this morning, we get the story of Abram, who goes on later to be named Abraham. So Abraham, same person. But Abram, at this point in the story, with Genesis chapter 12, we're introduced to him. And really the story of Abram is going to dominate the rest of Genesis. I mean, for a good portion of Genesis, he's going to be the character. And not only is he going to be the character in Genesis, but actually throughout the Bible. And if you understand Abram, you're going to understand a lot more of the Bible. I mean, you even think about when Jesus shows up on the scene and he says, you guys have pride because you think that you're descendants of who? Of David? Well, maybe kind of. Moses? Not really. Actually, you think because you're descendants of Abraham. And so everything is actually going to tie back to Abram at some point. And so if you understand Abram, you're going to understand a lot more of the Bible. And what we're going to see with Abram is that we're going to see a lot with all of our biblical heroes except for Jesus. Is that Abram's going to do some things that we go, man, I could never do that. I could never do that. Look at what he just did. I could never do that. And then Abram's also going to do some things where you would go, I would never do that. I would never do that. I could never do that, but I would never do that. And that's pretty much where we find ourselves, right? And we see actually one of the beautiful things I think that we see are our biblical heroes here. And really it's interesting because nothing's really said of Abram in the beginning. When we're introduced to Noah, we're told that Noah is a righteous man. But when we're introduced to Abram, it says nothing about that. We know that Abram has a father. His name was Terah. He had two brothers, Nahor and Haran. And Haran died. It says that Haran died in his father's presence. And we don't know how he died. We just know that Haran, the son, died before the father. And any of you fathers out there or parents out there, you know that you just go, it's not supposed to be that way. One generation is not supposed to pass. The younger generation is not supposed to pass before the older generation. And whenever that does happen, we go, that tragedy has taken place. Whenever the son dies before the father, there's tragedy. We know that. We know that Haran, which would have been Abram's brother, died before his father did. And we also know that we're introduced in the end of Genesis chapter 11 is that Sarai, Abram's wife, who will later on be named Sarah, same person, is that she's barren. She can have no kids. And so these are the two things. We go, a son who has died before his father and a wife who cannot have children. These are two, and if you've experienced either one of these, you know that this is a great tragedy. I mean, if you've ever experienced the loss of a child, you go, that's a grief that you would wish upon no one. Or if you have or are experiencing the grief of infertility, you go, that's a grief and a pain that you wish on no one. And yet, this is the canvas in which the story of Abram is painted. So, if you have your Bibles, let's jump in. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 1. It says this, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed. This is, we talk about the story of Abram. This is the call of Abram. Abram, now I want you to go. The word go here, it's a verb, and the verb is an imperative. You don't need to know a lot about grammar, but just know that imperative verbs mean they're not suggestions. Imperative verbs are something where it says, this is what's going to happen. Like when you are a kid and your parents said, go clean your room, that was an imperative, right? It's not a suggestion. Hey, I got an idea. Hey, I was just walking by your room, saw that it was messy. I thought maybe you should clean that up. That's an imperative, right? It's not a suggestion. It's not an idea, an option. This is what you're going to do. And so what God says here, he says, you're going to go. I want you to go, and I want you to leave the place for the place that I will show you. So I want you to go, and I want you to go where? Where should I go, God? To the place I'm going to show you. Now, this is not how we like with God, right? Well, we want God is to give us the plan. God, what's the plan? What's the plan? What's the route? What's the next 3 steps? And God sometimes, he won't even give you the next step. He says, I just want you to start walking, and then I will show you what the next step is. But that's not what we want. And really, truth be told, if I'm just being honest, what we want is we want God to lay out the plan for us, not just so that we can have certainty, so that we can actually judge if we should be obedient or not. So that God can say, here's the plan. You go, okay, I'm on board with that plan. I like that plan. That's a good plan, God. That's a good plan. I will go with you. But that's actually not how God works a lot of times. A lot of times God just says, what I want you to go. And what we want is we want clarity before obedience. God, I want to know what's the outcome. Where am I going to go? What's going to happen? What am I going to do? Because then I will judge, should I be obedient or not? And so what we want is we want clarity before we are obedient. In other words, we want our clarity to flow into our obedience. But actually, I find, I don't know about you, but I know about me, is actually clarity for me with God. Clarity doesn't often flow into obedience. Actually, clarity flows out of obedience. So God, so it's not like God's like, hey, I want you to do this because of X, Y, and Z. I'm like, okay, I'll go do that. But a lot of times God's like, I want you to do this. I'm like, God, I don't know. That doesn't make any sense to me. God's like, I did not ask you if it made sense. I asked you to be obedient. Now go do it. And then I go do it, and I go, oh, okay, now that makes sense. See, I think a lot of times what we want in life, we want the clarity that only time and space will give us. We want that on the front end. And so often that clarity will not flow into obedience. The clarity is going to flow out of obedience. And I think actually one of the other reasons why we want this clarity is we think that if we had the clarity, our anxiety would go down. And so we walk into this unknown. I mean, think about all of the unknowns we're walking into right now. And so then the anxieties go up. Oh my gosh. What will happen? What will happen? What will happen? And we just think to ourselves, if I just had that clarity, then my anxiety would go down. Have you ever played like the year from now game? Or the 5 years from now game where I'm like, I always feel like, man, if I could just for a moment, fast forward in my life for 5 years or a year to see what resolution this is, then maybe in this moment, my anxiety would go down. One, we're not afforded that. But two, I was thinking about this week, is that actually a lot of times, you think about your own life. If you actually were able to do that, for a lot of us in this room, our anxiety would not go down. It would actually go up. If we actually had the clarity, our anxiety wouldn't go down. Our anxiety would go up. I feel like sometimes I'm like, God, I just want the clarity so that my anxiety would go down. God's like, you want the clarity? Okay, I'll tell you, I'll give you the clarity. This is going to happen. That's going to happen. Now this is going to happen. That's going to happen. And I would not be like, oh, okay, cool. I'll be like, wait, what? My anxiety would go up, not down. And so we want this clarity. And really what we see with Abram is just go. And notice how it goes from generic to specific. I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your people. But I also want you to leave your father's house. It's one thing to leave your country, but you could leave your country with all your people and your family's house. But God says, I want you to leave your country. I want you to leave your people. And I want you to leave, and I think the big thing for him, I want you to leave your father's house. And it may not sound like a big deal to you, but especially in a patriarchal culture, this is going to be a huge deal. And then he says, but I got 4 promises for you. The 4 promises is, one, I'm going to show you the land. But notice here, we're going to see it change here. But notice here is, I'm going to show you the land, not actually even give you the land. I think a lot of times we know because God's going to give the land to Abram, we read give the land here, but he doesn't get that. What he gives is, I'm going to show you the land. So I'm going to show you the land, and I will make you a great nation. So promise 1 is, I will show you the land. Promise 2 is, I'm going to make you a great nation and a great name. This idea of a great nation is more than just a great family. It's more than just a great clan. This is a great nation, which implies things like land, government, and I'm going to make a name for you. That's what he says. He says, I'm going to make a name for you. I'm going to make your name great. That's part of the promise. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. But do you remember when I just recapped what I said what happened with the Tower of Babel? And the Tower of Babel, the people said, we want to make our name great. And God thwarted that plan. And that's in Genesis chapter 11. And then in Genesis chapter 12, God says, Abram, I'm going to make your name great. So they go, oh. It's not that God necessarily opposes you having a great name, but about who is making that name great. I think right now, we live in this world of self-promotion. And all social media has done is add gasoline to the fire. We are already a self-promoting kind of people, kind of culture before social media. Now with social media, it's about views and likes and followers. Just promote. You got to get your name out there. You got to get what you're doing out there. You got to get your name out there. You got to get yourself out there. Self-promote. And a lot of times what you find in the self-promotion is that it's just empty. And so actually here we have in Genesis chapter 11, the Tower of Babel builders, they're self-promoters. And actually what God says about Abraham, and Abram, he says, Abram, I'm gonna like make your name great. So I thought about this week. I go, do you know the names of the people who the guy who built the Tower of Babel? No. How about the great king who commissioned the Tower of Babel? No. Do you know the name of the architect that built this great Tower of Babel? No. Do you know the story and the name of Abraham? Yeah. I love it when God's word proves to be true. Self-promotion may work for a time, but it will fail. The Tower of Babel and the story of Abram tell me that. You know that a great name is a gift from God, not an achievement of man. And so he says, I'm going to show you the land. That's promise 1. I'm going to make you a nation and make your name great. That's promise 2. And then I'm going to bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And then he says, all of the families shall be blessed through you. That's the 4th promise. So actually, Abram, this is not just about you. This is not just about you and your family. This is not about you, your family, your clan. This isn't even about you, your family, your clan, your nation. This is about you, your family, your clan, your nation, the world. All of the families. This is what it says. All of the families are going to be blessed through you. It's actually one of the things that Jesus critiques the people of Israel when he shows up. Because the people of Israel, we'll find out, they're all descendants of Abram. They are to be what? A blessing to the world. And so when Jesus shows up, one of his critiques that he has of the people of Israel, he goes, you guys are supposed to be a blessing to the world, and you're not. All of the world, the whole world is supposed to be blessed through you, the descendants of Abram. Because that was, why? Because that was the promise back in Genesis chapter 12. In 2015, it was estimated that 3.8 billion people, so at that time about 55% of the world's population, 3.8 billion people would identify themselves in one of the 3 major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. 55% of the world's population, 55% of the world's populations would identify themselves as either Christian, Jewish, as Judaism, or with Islam. And you go, with that, one of the crazy things is that actually all 3 of those, and there's more than that, but all 3 of those would call Abraham or Abram part of the father of their faith. He's Father Abraham. We go over 55%, or 55% of the world's population actually still look to Abraham as some sort of spiritual father. And so we see you can't conjure this stuff up. You can't make this stuff up. You can't just invent this stuff. And yet here we are. And so we see the God's promises. He's making these promises. And we find out that God, and we see God as the promise maker. But what's interesting here is that God's making these promises to Abram, but they don't seem to be in response to anything that Abram has done. This is very important, I think. This is why I think it's important that it doesn't start off with Abram was righteous, and so God said, go to the land that I will show you, and here are the promises that I'm going to give. It doesn't say any of that. In fact, what we know of Abram's, it seems to be his father, and further on they would have been worshipers of the moon. And so it's interesting that God makes these promises to Abram, but they don't seem to be dependent upon anything that Abram has already done. It doesn't like God says, okay, I see you, Abram. I see you down there. I see what you're doing. Let me tell you, okay, Abram, I see what you've done for me. Let me tell you what I'm going to do for you now. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless those who curse you. I'm going to curse those who curse you. I'm going to give you a land. I'm going to show you a land. I'm going to bless the world through you. And there's no actually even if statements. I will show you the land if. I'll make you a great nation if. I will bless those who bless you if. I will bless the world if. There's none of that. They're all, God's saying, this is what I'm going to do, and these are the promises. I'm going to show you the land. I'm going to make you into a great nation with a great name. I'll bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, and I'll bless all of the families in the world through you. And so we find this here, that not only is God the promise maker, but that God's the promise maker, and he's also the promise keeper. That God's actually the promise maker, and he's the promise keeper. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot, which is his nephew. By the way, Lot was Haran's son, so really think about this. Abram can have no children at this point. Abram and Sarah can not have children. And then Abram's brother dies. His son is Lot. And so Lot has got no father. Abram's got no children. So it's going to be this real, although their nephew is going to be kind of like a father-like figure from between Abram and Lot. So Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And so Abram went. Abram went in a direction with a promise. But you notice how ambiguous the promises really are. Because we go, oh, those are great promises. I mean, they are great promises. But notice how ambiguous they are. Abram, go. Like, where do you want me to go? I will show you. Okay, fine. I will bless you. Great. How will you bless me? Don't worry about that. I will bless you. I'll also bless the world through you. That's great. How will you do that? Don't worry about that. All I want you to do right now is I want you to go. And he does this. And by the way, this is a beautiful picture of what faith looks like. Faith, unfortunately, in our world, I don't know why, but it's this super ambiguous thing that people always tell you should have more of. And you know that you lack. And so when you feel like, I feel like I lack faith, and when somebody tells you, you should have more faith, you go, yeah, I think that because I was feeling like I was lacking it. You go, yeah, so you should have more of it. Okay, so how do I do that? And I go, why is this so ambiguous? I define faith, and you've probably heard me say this before, but if you've been here at all, but really, faith is the act of belief and trust in the promises of God. So it's the active. So in other words, you're doing something, belief and trust in the promises of God. In other words, God has made promises, and you make decisions and base your life as if those promises are true. It's not like when we say faith is not just this feeling good about God or just going like, oh yeah, singing great things about God. It's actually, God, you've made promises. I believe those promises to be true, even though I have not seen them yet, but I will make decisions in my life based on those promises. I go, that's faith. So for instance, when God says, I hear your prayers, you go, okay, I'm going to pray now. I'm going to pray with confidence that, God, you hear me, because one of your promises was that you hear your people as they pray. And so now when I pray, I'm going to pray with, one, I'm going to pray because you actually hear me. Two, I'm going to pray with this confidence. It's a prayer in faith with confidence that you hear me because that's been your promise to me. Or when God says forgiveness is better than bitterness, you go, okay, I'm going to make decisions in my life and live in a way that says that, God, I believe what you promise is true and is going to come to fruition. And so I'm going to make decisions based on that. And you kind of get this, right, when you say that you lose, like, I lost faith in somebody, like, oh, I totally lost faith in that person over there. I go, you this person over here? Yeah, yep, totally lost. I got no faith in them. And what would you say? What you're really saying is that I don't believe any of the promises that they make. Let me say it. Are you saying that you don't believe they exist anymore? Well, they're dead to me. Okay, that's different. But are you saying that they don't exist anymore, right? No, you believe that there's an existence, that they're living, that they're breathing. What you're saying when you said, I have zero faith in them, what you're saying is that I don't trust a word that they say. And so when they say, I'll pay you back, you're like, okay, all right. Sounds good. Are you actually saying that, so when you say like, I don't believe that, and actually a lot of times in that, you're not saying that you don't believe they will actually have money. What you are saying is that they'll probably actually have money, they're just never going to give it back to you. And what you're saying is that when you say I've lost faith, is you go, they're making promises, and I don't believe those promises are going to come true. And so that's what faith is. Faith is this active belief and trust in the promises of God. And I think a lot of times in our world, faith has become this thing in which we have that conjures up the work of God. And I go, that's not biblical. Where you go, in other words, if I have enough faith, then God, it'll force God to move. If I have enough faith, then I will conjure up the work of God. And I go, but that's not what that is. In other words, like, if I have enough faith, God will fulfill his promises. But if I lack faith, then God won't fulfill his promises. And I go, well, here's the problem with that. That puts God's ability and his identity as promise keeper on your faith. And if God fulfilling his promises is dependent mostly upon your faith, then you're in trouble. I'm in trouble. I need God's, and you need God's, like, his promise-keeping ability to be in something greater than your faith. And so, and I don't know, like, we've come into this world where the faith, has become this way to conjure up the work of God. And so maybe I'll talk with somebody who's sick. And they go, I need to have more faith. I go, yeah, we all need to have more faith. Well, I need to trust more. I need to have more faith that God will supernaturally heal me. And I go, that's not a bad thing to believe in. And I'll say, do you believe that God has promised that to you? Do you believe that God has promised you healing? And every now and then I'll hear somebody go, yeah, actually, I do. Like, I do feel like God's promised me that. And I go, then roll with that. But a lot of times, actually, what I hear, do you feel like God has promised you healing? A lot of times I hear, I don't know. And they take that I don't know as a lack of faith. When I go, no, the I don't know is just an I don't know. And that's what I would say. I don't know if God has specifically promised you healing. And so this whole idea of like, I'm not being healed because I don't have enough faith to conjure up God's healing ability. I go, well, maybe that you have the faith that you need. It's that the healing is just not God's promise to you. And so in those places, I would say, but you know what I know? That either way, that God has promised to comfort you and encourage you. He may not take away the affliction, but he has promised to comfort you and to care for you and to encourage you in said affliction. And so let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to pray. And we're going to ask God to heal. Absolutely. We're going to ask God to heal. And we hope that he does. But you know what we could pray with greater confidence? That in the midst of your affliction, that he would comfort you, he would care for you, and he would encourage you. And we say that is the place of great faith. God is the promise maker and the promise keeper. And all Abram is doing is living in the shadows of those two truths. That's all that he's doing. It's just interesting because we read this story, right? I mean, think about this. We read this story, and if you're familiar with this story, you know how it goes. But we read this story, and God makes these 4 wonderful promises, and then it says, then there's this little verse that Abram went, and we go, oh, look at Abram and his faith. Look at Abram and his faith. Look at Abram and his faith. We go, but God just made 4 wonderful promises. How do we walk away from that, and we walk away with, but look how faithful Abram is. I go, God is the promise maker. He is the promise keeper. And all Abram is doing is living in the shadows of those two truths. Goes on then in 5 through 9. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord, who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country in the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent. And with Bethel he on the west, and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. And then Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. And so then God appears to Abram. And we don't know what he does, but we know that he appears. And by the way, there's a difference between hearing God speak and having God appear to you. There's one thing maybe going like, I was reading the Bible and I was like, man, like God was really speaking to me, or even through this message or through prayer, and God was really speaking to you. That's totally different than God appearing to you. And so what we see is that God speaks to Abram. Abram moves and goes to this land that God will show him, and then in the land that God will show him is then we see even a greater, like this greater intimacy, which is now God has now appeared to him. And in his appearing to him, he says, I'm going to give this land to your ancestors. Now what's beautiful about this is what was the first promise was, I will show you the land. So he's actually fulfilled that promise, right? He showed him the land. And how does he, I love this. God answers the one promise, or sorry, he fulfills the one promise by giving what? Another promise. And so he goes, so here's the land. It's like, this is wonderful. Yeah, and it's going to be yours, but not necessarily yours in the sense, yours, and I'm going to give it to your ancestors. And he does 2 things. Abram does 2 things in response to this. He builds an altar, and he calls upon the name of the Lord. That's what he does. In fact, actually, he builds 2 altars, and calls upon the name of the Lord. And so why build an altar? Well, building an altar would have been one of the ways to establish the presence of said God in said land. Right? So we would say there's altars to other gods, right? So I'm saying in general, an altar would be a way. Later on, they'll be used for sacrifice purposes. We don't have a understanding that would be happening here, but really what the altar will do is establish the presence of that God in that land. And so when God says, I'm going to give you this land to your ancestors, he says, then I'll build you an altar. And notice how this is working here, by the way. This is in contrast to the Tower of Babel. Don't forget that. What did the Tower of Babel people do? They built a tower to establish themselves in said land, to make a name for themselves. Then directly after that story, we get Abram, where God says, I'm going to establish your name. I'm going to give you this land. And Abram's response to that is, then I will establish a building that's to you. And so really it's the story, the Tower of Babel and the people of Abram are these two like contrasting stories. And we see the one that God's telling a story through. And notice how Abram builds him an altar, but he's still in like this nomad tent. God, I'm going to establish you here before I'm really established here. I think the truth is if we were telling the story, we would build ourselves a house, and then God would have this nice little altar in the courtyard of our said house. I will establish myself before I would establish you. And then he called on the name of the Lord. Built 2 altars and called on the name of the Lord. It's kind of like worship. But notice how he does these 2 things before any promise is really fulfilled. I mean, in the sense where he says, I'm going to give you the land to your ancestors. He goes, okay, that with that statement, because I believe that's true. This is the faith. I believe that promise is so true, I'm going to worship now. I go, that's not what we do. We have promises from God, and we go, well, let's just see how this thing plays out before I can turn to God and worship. Let's just see if his promises really do come true before I turn to him and worship. But that's not what Abram does. What Abram does is that there's this promise, as the promise comes in, that then Abram responds to said promise with worship. And so God is the promise maker. God is the promise keeper. And all Abram does is he lives in the shadows of those 2 truths. And by the way, as we unfold Abraham's story, once again, what did I tell you? There'll be places where you go, I could never do that. Maybe this is one of them. I could never leave my family. I could never leave the home I know. I could never leave that for something that I don't know. I don't know if I could do that. But there's also going to be places where you go, I would never do that. And spoiler alert, next week you're going to get one that would go, I would never do that. But really, as we'll find out, that every time Abram goes sideways, is he steps away from those 2 truths. That God, that you are the promise maker and you are the promise keeper. And whatever I do is in response to those 2 truths. God, you're the one that makes the promises, and you're the one that keeps the promises. And my life is a response to that. Because I think so often what we do is we go, God, you've made some promises, now it's my job to keep them. And if I'm faithful enough, if I'm good enough, if I'm right enough, if I go to church enough, if I read your Bible enough, if I pray enough, if I give enough, if I do enough, then you will actually keep your promises to me. And I go, that's not, I guess it comes from somewhere. It doesn't come from here. God's God's promise-keeping ability is rooted more in his character than it is yours. God's promise-keeping ability is rooted more in his faithfulness than it is in yours. And so this is why we can be unfaithful, or when we are unfaithful, that God remains faithful to us. And this is actually what we will see in the story of Abram. Even though he's unfaithful to God, is that God continues to be faithful to him. Why? Because God is the promise maker. He is the promise keeper. And all Abram does is live in the shadow of those two truths. By the way, not only is that true of Abram, but that is true for you too. It's interesting because people will read the story of Abram, they'll go, oh, God spoke to me. Yeah, what did he speak to you? Yeah, God told me this morning that that he was going to show me a land, and that he was going to give me that land, and then in faith he would make my name great, and he would bless those who bless me and curse those who curse me. And I go, yeah, that's not your promise. That's Abraham's promise. That was his promise. You have promises, and maybe that's one of them, but that was Abram's promise. But no, although the promises may be different, is that you actually follow the same promise-making, promise-keeping God. That's why we talk about, when we talk about we have faith in Jesus. And Christianity is about having faith in Jesus. And it's like, well, you gotta believe in Jesus. I go, yeah, but greater than that, right, is actually having faith in Jesus. And not just believing that he lived and died, but actually having faith in him. What does that faith mean, right? Is that I have an active trust and belief in his promises. That Jesus is not only the promise maker, but also the promise keeper. And he made some great promises. Promises like, I will redeem you. I will forgive you. I will heal you. I will restore you. I will mold and shape you into my likeness. I will give you right standing before the Father. You will be holy. I mean, these are promises. And it's interesting because we hear those promises by Jesus, and often that's what Christians do. We hear those promises for Jesus, and we think, okay, now it's my job to go out and fulfill all those promises. I go, no, it's not your job to go out. Your job is to go out and live as if those promises are already true. Jesus says, I'm going to redeem you. Guess what? He's going to keep that promise. He's going to redeem you. Your job is to live in the shadow of that truth. That Jesus promises to forgive you, then he's already forgiven you. Your job is to live in the shadow of that truth. And so it's the same for you. Talk about how this faith in Jesus, that's what it means to have faith in Jesus. Jesus, what we receive you as the promise maker and the promise keeper. That your death, your resurrection atoned for my sins and made me right before the Father. And so I don't know where you are in your own journey. But know this, is that the God that you want, the God you long for, the God that you maybe hopefully are already following, is the one who both keeps and makes the promises. And my prayer for you is that you would live in the shadow of those two truths.